Hello and welcome to the Hive podcast with me, Natalie Nahai. In this fifth season, I'll be exploring how we can change the ways in which we relate to and structure our existing systems so that we can build towards a more resilient future. From alternative economic models and business practices to our role in and perception of the more than human world, this season will explore how we might design ways of living that both enrich and sustain all forms of life, not just our own. For more information, you can find additional resources and links at natalienahai.com/The Hive Podcast. And you can also reach out to me on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn at Natalie Nahai. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Looby MacNamara, an author, facilitator, designer, gardener, and mother. Having discovered permaculture in 1999, Looby was deeply inspired by the collaborative learning environment and the focus on emerging solutions through collective wisdom, and she has since written 4 books connected with these themes: Cultural Emergence, People in Permaculture, 7 Ways to Think Differently, and Strands of Infinity. One of the leading voices of the permaculture movement, Looby has been a senior diploma tutor, a trustee and chair of the Permaculture Association, and she has taught and pioneered personal and social permaculture. Her first book, People in Permaculture, was written to globally translate the principles and design methods of permaculture for people-based systems, and her creation, the Design Web, has been used by thousands of people to create all sorts of designs. In 2016, she set up the Applewood Permaculture Centre with her family, where they run courses and grow their own food. In this conversation, we talk about everything from the 3 phases or stages of cultural emergence to ways in which we can build resilience and empowerment with ourselves and one another, and we even touch on how we might rethink the way that we educate. This is a really beautiful conversation that goes in all kinds of directions, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Looby, thank you so much for your time and for being in conversation with me today.
Yeah, thank you. It's lovely to be here.
So I'd like to start, I'm going to invert the questions that I usually begin with, but I'd like to start by asking about this book that you recently released, which is called Cultural Emergence, a toolkit for transforming ourselves and the world, which draws upon your great experience in permaculture design, systems thinking, and also the lineages of indigenous wisdom. Can you tell me a bit about what cultural emergence means to you and perhaps what moved you to write the book?
So as you said, I've been involved in permaculture for 2 decades now, and permaculture comes from this contraction of the word permanent agriculture and permanent culture. And for a while, that question of permanent culture has been fermenting with me of what does that mean? Where are we trying to go with that? And my work in 2012, I published a book, People and Permaculture, and that really focused on the people care ethic of permaculture and how we can use design to design our individual and collective well-being and how we can make permaculture relevant to everyone. And then through that in 2016, I was invited to collaborate with John Young, who has got a lineage in deep nature connection and indigenous elders in the US. And we came together and we actually said, well, instead of doing my bit and your bit, well, let's see what emerges, what's the new territory we can go into. And we looked at what was the commonalities of our work and what was the vision that we both held. And we realised that it is about this emerging a new culture that actually, when we look at it as the question of, are we connected to the more than human world? Are we empowered in our own lives? Are we healthy? These are cultural questions. Individual well-being sits within a cultural context. And so when we start to adapt the cultural context we're in, then we have capacity for growth and regeneration. This phrase of regenerative culture is one that's getting used more now. It's kind of replacing sustainability, and we're sort of saying, well, actually, it's not sustainability we want, is regeneration. So how do we regenerate, and then what does that actually mean? And so I've pulled it down into it's creating cultures of personal leadership, collective wisdom, and planetary care.
So then connecting with that idea of regeneration and some of the cultural context you've described, from your perspective, maybe from that perspective, what do you think may be happening in the global human psyche right now, if we can use that frame?
So we have 3 phases of cultural emergence, and there's practices that activate all of these phases. And the 3 phases are challenge and awaken, move and invigorate, nourish and empower. And when we have a balance of those, then we're moving into this fertile emergence where, health and prosperity and wellness and creativity and empowerment and all of these things can emerge. But we need a balance of those. And if we have too much of one, then it can sap our energy rather than regenerate us. And that's a balance over a day, a week, a month, a year, a lifetime even. And that balance is different for each of us. But I think there's a collective at the moment, a collective imbalance, and we've got too much of the challenge and awaken. So the challenge and awaken has practices of awareness of culture. So this is really a lot of the unseen patterns of our culture, the values, the norms, the parameters, the beliefs. They're all being shifted around, and a lot of things that were unseen and maybe unspoken have kind of come to the surface. And another of the practices of cultural emergence that connect with the challenge and awaken phase is pattern disruption. And every single one of us on the planet, I believe, has had huge pattern disruption over the last year with the pandemic. And so we're trying to kind of reform what's happening. And I think on an individual level, maybe even a community level, there has been some of the nourish and empower and the move and invigorate. But on a collective level, that isn't really happening. I would say on a big scale, the government's narrative isn't around empowering the people. It isn't about supporting us emotionally. It isn't, so there's a lack of that, and there's also a lack of the move and invigorate. Okay, how do we design our way out of this? How do we design more resilient systems? How do we adapt the systems that we've got so that they're more functional for the purpose, for the time and context that we're in? And so that's what I believe is happening. We're actually getting too much challenge and awaken, and it isn't being balanced by the other phases.
That's such a fascinating perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite simplistic, but then I think there's actually quite a truth in that simplicity.
And so I'd like to pull on the thread of resilience, which you mentioned as one of the themes, and it's something that you explore in your work as well, this idea of building individual and also collective resilience. And it feels to me particularly poignant at this moment in time, given all the challenges that we face. What are some of the ways in which we can support ourselves and others to proactively adjust to change and transitions, especially when they are so complex and hard?
So resilience is used in kind of quite a few different ways, and to pull that down, I like kind of pulling these complex terms into sort of simple categories that do interconnect and overlap, but I find them helpful. So I think there's resilience in terms of our attitudes and our thoughts, so our mind resilience. And then there's the practical resilience strategies, like you've got rainwater butts, you've got food growing in the garden, you've got multiple ways to heat your building. And so there's the practical resilience, which permaculture is very advanced. Is very much a focus of permaculture design, is creating practical resilience strategies. And then there's another third level of community resilience as well, so taking it out from the individual into how do we function as a group, as a family, as a community, as a country, taking that out. And first thing as well is to then think about what is the type of resilience that we're looking for. So is it that we need more resilience in our thinking, or more resilience in our community, or more practical strategies? And of course we need a balance of all of those things, but sometimes even if you have food in your cupboards and food in your garden, if you're not tuned into feeling resilient, then those can be quite blind to you. Those, those abundances that you have of, water coming out of your tap, clean water coming out of your tap, can be really blind to you if you haven't got the thinking strategies that support you to appreciate that and to recognise that it is a privilege that not everyone in the world has. And then it's also a case of, in terms of resilience, this thought of, are we trying to get back to where we were, or are we trying to move forward, transformative resilience? So Chris Johnson talks about this in terms of, is it adaptive resilience? Is it transformative resilience? Is it bounce back? Are we bouncing back? Or are we bouncing forwards? Or are we bouncing with? And then and then spreading resilience as well. So how do we spread those strategies around so that, like the trees would do, where they'd send out messages to their fellow trees. There's a parasite there. Build your cell structure to cope with that better. And so, what is it that we're aiming for? We hear a lot about the back to normal or the new normal, and there isn't a really clear message there of us trying to recognise that actually we weren't in a very functioning global place. We can redesign for more resilience in the future. That narrative isn't very mainstream in terms of the media and the government messages at the moment.
And actually, so that weaves nicely into the piece around education. So how we choose to educate ourselves on the systems that we might like to envision and create, the things that we take for granted that maybe we want to change our relationship with. And so if I were to ask you, what do you think are some of the things that we need to change in education in order to facilitate, I guess, a more resilient culture, a more rich dialogue around what we kind of want to build? How would we change education? What are some of the things that you see working that would be better?
I think there needs to be more focus on problem solving and adaptation. So more awareness given to our children that we as adults, we don't have the answers, that we need to co-create them, that there is a world coming that we haven't designed for. Well, actually not coming, we're present in a world that we haven't designed for. And so I think the current curriculum actually needs to be re-examined and said, what is it that our children need? And there's lots of media stories at the moment about how there's a pandemic in mental health in our children at the moment, and it really needs to be re-examined of what is appropriate for them at the moment, and actually catering more for the individual. So at the moment in the UK, children are required to be online with their lessons now between 9 and 3:30, which is a long time to be on a screen. That sense of actually moving from one class to another, it works in the school, but at home actually it doesn't work. And maybe this is working for some children who need the discipline, but then not some other children who maybe would like to learn from their parents who are working at home and could do some apprenticeship with their parents, or some more project-based work, so that they're like, okay, can I learn to weave baskets at the moment, or can I go deeper into one particular topic? And through that, if the children were allowed to do that and allowed to follow their own interests, which is what home education is, is based on, really, as traditional home education, not school children just stuck at home. If they were allowed to do that, then what we would find is a lot of surfacing of gifts, that there would be a lot of children that would really discover, what they really love to do. There'll be some children who become expert football players because they're allowed to go and spend 3 or 4 hours a day kicking a football around, and then you'll get other children who become amazing guitar players or artists, or some that really love reading books, some that will write a book in this time, some who will actually really discover how to meditate and sit and be quiet and connected. So I think the education system needs to be redesigned so that it isn't so goal orientated and exam orientated and output orientated, and just allows children to find their own learning path, so that they're leaning into their own resilience.
I love that idea. It makes me think of the Montessori schools and the Steiner schools that really give greater latitude to children and young people to dive into the areas that they're most drawn to, that they have aptitude and passion for.
Yeah, and then through that, it kind of doesn't matter what that is, but through finding that passion, then that builds confidence. Then that builds that idea that actually through practice, through commitment and motivation, they can learn something and they can go deep into something, and that will give them the confidence for then whatever next they want to learn, rather than the schooling it gets you. The furthest you can go is as far as you can go to get your A grade in that exam, whereas actually, it's quite a narrow train track that kids are on to get to their exams, whereas this is much broadening the field widely. And I think that will really help children's mental health as well.
Given that there's so much difficulty, especially in the research that I've read around primary caregivers who are typically mothers, who are having to try and find some kind of balance between supporting their children at home and also being able to continue their professional commitments. Do you think that we're seeing more of a public dialogue around how we've structured these systems and how separated they've become? So the tension between, wanting to be able to show up for your kids, whoever you might be, and then also have a capacity to work. These are being pitted against each other. And it makes me think of, when you talk about this wonderful idea of traditional homeschooling, of course, that's something which one has to actively, consciously design for. And I wonder if you feel that there's now becoming a bit more space in the public sphere for people to say, well, actually, do we want to change the way that we educate? Do we want to make it more in line with the way that we live in terms of its fit with our careers, so that we can find a more balanced way of living? That's quite a large sort of domain, but I wonder what your thoughts are around that. Do you think people are becoming more interested in different forms of balancing education and work life?
I think so. I think that it's happening. I think, unfortunately, that the places where those thoughts are happening are then not able to get out. So I'm sure it's happening within households around the world, of questioning it, but then being trapped in whatever work situation we're in, and whatever government guidelines are coming down to how our children are being educated, and there isn't enough consultation there to really work out what is the best fit. How can the teachers redesign it, let alone the parents? So I think it's quite a slow trickle down at the moment. So I think there is a lot of discontent. I'm not sure that that's translated yet into what is this opportunity to redesign our education systems, and how do we actually do that? I don't think that's really come through the narrative as yet, apart from in small pockets. I'm sure every parent, teacher and child up and down the land has been considering that it's not working, it's not a good fit at the moment. And it will change as well, and there's a lot of people who are still kind of waiting for schools to go back and things to get back to how they were. And so I think there's a lot of people that are kind of just waiting at the moment.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, especially when there's so much uncertainty, it's hard to know what to do next. And I think one of the things that comes up in conversation a lot for me with my peers and friends is, if you're in a position where you're lucky enough not to be having to support others, whether it's young family or dependents of any kind or relatives, whatever it might be, if you have the bandwidth to start engaging with these kinds of questions, then maybe that's a responsibility we can take on to at least sow the seeds for these changes to happen, for there to be more flexibility. Do you feel that we're seeing a shift in terms of the values that we hold, whether it's through the leadership of younger generations engaging in conversations about life balance, or in general response to the crisis, that our priorities have somehow changed in the last 12 months?
I think so. I think there has been way more kind of questions around that have arisen around global inequalities, around local inequalities, access to food, to education, to healthcare, different valuing of jobs. So jobs that were labelled as unskilled and before the pandemic suddenly become key workers. So that I think there has been this revealing of values. I think there's a process going on of kind of revaluing, and how does that revaluing echo out into pay and where we funnel our resources. I think that's a process that's happening, but there's definitely way more questioning of values because there's many things that were unseen below the surface that we were actually living our lives by, our policies by, that we didn't question before. And there has been more questioning going on now, which is the first step in realigning them.
And I think one of the interesting things to emerge from this situation is the questioning that I'm seeing, at least in the role that capitalist systems play in the destruction of our home, in the destruction of what we call natural resources. Even the language is kind of problematic, but I've been reading recently quite a lot about natural capital. And on the one hand, I understand that this language in some ways serves a function in terms of reframing what people think of as valuable, especially within the capitalist realms, within business realms. But the other part of me really winces at the thought that we have to point towards something and its worth in terms of what it can give us, what it can do for us. What do you think about the ways in which the capitalist system could be changed, or maybe it needs to be replaced in order to create a culture which is more regenerative?
Or it's a difficult one, isn't it? It is a slippery slope, this kind of defining our ecosystem resources or natural resources or natural capital. It comes from the same worldview of only valuing what's of worth to us as humans, and not even of what's of worth to us as humanity as a whole, but to certain sectors. So it's actually, even if it's that rainforest is valuable to a lot of people, it's not. It's only if the governments consider it valuable, is it valuable? So I think it's a step, but it doesn't really bridge the gap into a regenerative culture. It still leaves this kind of massive hole in our worldview and our values and our understanding. There is kind of a huge sort of thing that needs to crumble, that capitalism needs to crumble, patriarchy needs to crumble and to be replaced with something that is truly regenerative. And that is a lot of work for a lot of people to come to terms with that and to realise that it will actually benefit them and future generations more.
I think just as you're saying that, I'm thinking in principle, I love the idea, but then how do we begin to do things like, I'm looking at my setup in my podcast room. I've got a microphone that I paid for and a laptop that someone or that many people made. And it's that kind of leaping into the great unknown, the need to be able to envision some other way of creating what we need and what we value that doesn't exist currently now. How do we begin to do that? Do you think it is a question of creating conditions in which we can start to be innovative along a different set of values? Do you think it's something which maybe our generation won't solve, but we'll be able to lay the groundwork for?
Well, we're certainly coming to a kind of point in human history where actually we need to solve these problems rather than thinking that a future generation will. And I think this is what the pandemic has shown us, is that we can't wait. The crisis is here. This is, we might get through the pandemic, but we're still actually in crisis zone. For many, many people around the planet at the moment, the pandemic isn't the biggest crisis that they're facing right now. It's just part of the contributing factors for the stress that their communities and their place, their land is under at the moment. There is a responsibility for all of us to realise that now is the time, and that we can't postpone that. We can't say it's too big for us at the moment, but hopefully future generations will solve it. We need to change the trajectory now, and that can happen in small ways as well. That from going to that, from that very big feeling, and I'm just feeling that in my body as I say it, that like it needs to change now, the whole systems, we can't wait, and how that brings up so much internally for me. And then also knowing that actually small shifts now can make a big difference to the destination in the future. So it's just that shifting of attention and priorities and cultural assumptions and all of that we can, that we can move. And we have this opportunity now where all of those things are loosened. So I think of culture as this complex web of patterns of thinking and behaving and interacting, and usually that web is kind of quite tightly woven. At the moment it's not. It's like this huge knot that's been pulled apart, and we have the opportunity to reweave it, reweave the culture so that we can create what we wanted.
I love the imagery there of this web that's kind of condensed into a knot, and that now there is greater mobility within it for us to start to pull out those threads and reweave. It's funny because when I was starting to research my book last year, I found that when I was reaching out to people, there was a period, especially towards the beginning, where there was just this sense of great openness towards having conversation. And I think it's actually, even though people are busied now and starting to try and find ways to cope or get back into some sort of rhythm, certainly within the business side of things, there does seem to be still this openness, this creativity, this curiosity in how we might change how things are. And so I wonder, in relation to your work, you've written about how we might design systems that are more generative than those we currently rely upon. And given the current time that we're in, are there any shifts that you've observed that give you cause for hope?
Yeah, we use this word design, and I think when we actually do follow design processes, so permaculture is very much based on design. It's about visioning, identifying limits, resources, patterns, finding out what our needs are. When we actually go through a design process, then what can emerge through that is really powerful. We can manifest and and that is, manifesting maybe sounds like a kind of new age word, but actually we're manifesting all the time. We're bringing things into reality, and you're doing that with a business. You're saying, okay, I want to run a business. I need to, manifest customers here. And so I think for me, the hope is that actually when we do that, when we do follow a design process, things will emerge, ideas, people, resources, new concepts, new ways of bringing things together, meeting our needs in more effective ways. All of those things will emerge through the process. And that gives me hope that actually we can engage in being proactive and creative and responsible and bring ourselves into our own sense of empowerment and ability to change, and our sense of agency for change. And that is, really important, whether that's in your family, in your children's schooling, in your own working from home setup, whatever it is, to just bring that about in small ways as well, and to help others to do that.
And so for people who are listening to this, and I'm particularly thinking of those who might be living in cities or built up areas who maybe have less access to green space or to gardens, for instance, or communal plots, what are some of the ways in which you might suggest they connect with that sense of wanting to become more empowered? What are some of the practices maybe or resources that might be helpful for people to start?
Yeah, so I don't live in a city, but I did grow up in a city. I think that it's about doing small steps every day, and not just necessary steps, but just to have a practice of self-care in your life that really enables you to feel that nourishment. So the nourish and empower phase, to do something creative every day, whether it's a little doodle or singing a song or just something that shifts you from being this like passive consumer of entertainment, of media, to actually being this producer, this actually giving something out, to be creative in some way. And I think that just starts to shift something very gently from this like feeling disempowered and everything's coming at you, to feeling like you have some agency there, some possibility there, and to use that to kind of create little patterns of success for yourself, that just slowly build momentums, that momentum, motivation, movement, how those three, converge with each other. And yeah, just asking questions as well of your own beliefs. If it's saying, well, do I really believe this, or where's this belief come from? Have I been culturally conditioned into thinking that I want more? And then a third thing. So one is kind of being self-care and being creative and being a producer. The other is kind of questioning things, questioning your own thinking all the time, so that you start to recognize what is inherited cultural conditioning and what your actually own beliefs and values are. And then the third thing is coming into service and being asking the question of like, how can I help other people at the moment, and recognizing then that we have certain privileges of health, of finance, of where we live, and all of these privileges that we have. And it might not be that we're necessarily able to give in terms of money, but maybe we can give our time, maybe we can just actually listen, have a conversation with our neighbours that gives them a little bit of hope and connection in the day. So how can we be of service? Just who can we phone up to just have a friendly chat with. What can we give? And that shifts things away as well.
I love that. It's very concrete, but also quite heartfelt set of things that we can do. So if there were a book that you've read that you've been inspired by or that has touched you, what book would you recommend that people read and why?
Well, I've been reading Braiding Sweetgrass, which is a lovely book that really connects us with the reciprocity of life and connects us with the plant wisdom and brings us more into a sense of community with the whole world rather than this human nature separation paradigm that we are currently under, and to bring us more into connection with other beings. So yeah, I'd highly recommend Braiding Sweetgrass.
I love that book. I read it recently also, and it's just so magical in the way that it's written, especially because it touches on so many scientific aspects of the living world, and it somehow manages to weave it into this really quite sensuous, touching landscape. I don't know, it's a very alive book.
It is. It's the stories and the science and the heart are all woven in there, aren't they?
And so if I were to ask you what you would like your legacy to be, how might you begin to answer that?
Oh, that's a big question, interesting question. When I started teaching permaculture, or sort of a few years after I started teaching permaculture, I realised that there's a limit to how many people I can teach, and that I needed to go to the next layer of doing permaculture teacher trainings so that I'm training people to teach. And so I'm constantly feeling like, okay, what's my highest use? So, I could take that to another level and then say, well, now I need to train people to run the teacher trainings, and to constantly be moving forward in my niche so that there are people behind that then fill that, and I'm constantly working at my highest use. So I'd like to feel that there is this legacy of people who can teach cultural emergence, can teach permaculture, of cultural emergence designers that are engaged and feeling empowered to share. And yeah, that would be lovely to feel that there's all these people, that there is this team of people that could carry on the work that I've started, carry on and evolve it, and the thought that they are expanding into edges that I wouldn't be able to reach, so that that it's not just they're doing what I do, but they are doing what they can do to their highest use as well. So it's just encouraging us all to be working to our highest use.
I love that image, and it's a lovely way of phrasing it as well. So if I were to ask you what question you might like people to dwell with at this moment in time, what would you suggest?
What is my gift that I can offer to the world in this time? And then consider how that could be a contribution to the world, because sometimes we get caught up in trying to imagine what the world needs, and actually then that kind of maybe leads us into jobs or places or responsibilities that don't match our gifts. Whereas if we come from what is my gift and then find ways to give it to out into the world, then that's a regenerative way that will grow.
I love the way that you flip that question. It's really, it's lovely. It makes it much more inviting as a question of what we can actually bring to the world in terms of what we have to contribute. And so finally, I'd like to end with this question. It's another quite large, imaginal question. And so please feel free to answer this in whatever way you feel moved. What vision of the world are you holding for others?
Oh, that is a lovely question, isn't it? A lovely question to dwell on and to really feel that way. And I started my permaculture career with an activity at the end of my permaculture design course, and we were asked to express what our long-term goals and visions are for ourselves. And we were invited to not think about what we thought was possible, but just what we wanted, what we thought would excite us, what we thought would be fun. And I put out into the world, I said, I was following the what would be fun. And I said, I'd like to teach permaculture in the future because I've just had so much fun here on this course. And I didn't put that out into the world as a pathway, a design, or a strategy. I just said it quite flippantly, actually. But it was kind of like, what? Oh, yeah, that would be really fun. Yeah, I'd like to do that. And then from having said that, well, my whole journey has unfolded. And, there was like the signs came there of like, and this opportunity for this meeting and this course and what have you opened up for me by just following that. What would it be like? What was the fun? And so I think for us all with our visioning, how can we express this? What we feel would be fun, would be healthy, would be nourishing, and to really let go of that can't happen, that isn't possible, that yes, but no, I can't, no, not, that will never happen, all of those limiting phrases, and to just express for ourselves what we think would be possible. And we have one of those principles of cultural emergence, which is allowing for the possibility of the seemingly impossible. I'll just share that again, allowing for the possibility of the seemingly impossible. So how can we engage with that possibility in a hopeful way, and to just put it out there, voice it, write it, do a social media post about it, about what you would like the world to look like, what would be fun to imagine, and to hold that as a seed. So outside of my window here, I have an oak tree, and it's produced hundreds of acorns here, and you can pick up a whole handful with dozens in there, and they're completely different, the acorns, to the oak tree. But each one of those acorns has the potential to transform into an oak tree that will live for hundreds of years. And so we are holding with the seeds of our visions. They're seeds that can totally transform into something strong and huge and regenerative. I'd like to invite us all to connect with our vision that we might see as these seeds, and we can't understand how this seed will transform and become real. But that's the magic and the hope of emergence.
Thank you for listening to the Hive podcast with me, Natalie Nahai. To find out more about today's guest and the topics we explored, you can visit the show notes page at natalienahai.com/The Hive Podcast. And if you enjoyed the show, please do give it a rating or review, as it helps to reach new ears. My thanks to Caro C for producing. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to sharing more with you in the next episode.